So 2 months ago now, on the 4th of July, I began work on a project to stretch my front-end and back-end web development skills. It's been quite some time since I've done any sort of web design or development in general, to be honest. I wanted to sort of stretch my legs a little because over the next year I plan on doing some sort of freelancing or maybe even just working on different websites and releasing them and just seeing what I can do basically. So 2 months ago, I began work on one of my projects called OneWord. Basically, the idea behind making this was just to stretch my web development skills. I'm actually quite rusty when it comes to web development because I haven't actually done anything in the web development space for over probably about 2.5 years. Not properly. As well as that, I also wanted to have a little bit of fun and experiment because at the time we were right in the middle of lockdown and I was really bored, so I wanted a project to work on. The premise behind OneWord is that it's actually a word game. The idea of it is that you have 2 players, well actually up to 4 players, but for the sake of example, 2 players. And the first player creates a story, so they give you a title, which is the prompt for a story. The idea behind it is that the 2 players, or however many players are in your story, will actually build a story word by word. So each player gets to put in 1 word to the story. So my idea had several requirements, and that was real-time data communication for the front and back end of the application, because obviously for things like new words being put into the story, for things like matchmaking, for things like typing indicators, all those sorts of things, when a player joins and leaves, I needed to have a way to notify all the players what was going on with the game. So real-time data communication was it was like the core of this project basically, and it's something that I've not actually worked with before, so I was quite excited to check that out. Of course, my second most important requirement for this project was to have something that would stretch my legs a little bit in way of sort of expanding my skills, but as well as that I also wanted something that wasn't going to hold me back. I didn't want to work with a library or framework that was actually going to get in my way of developing my final idea. So that brings us to what I use, the frameworks and the libraries. So for the back end, I decided to use Node. Now, this is actually uncharted territory for me. I mean, I've spent most of my programming years actually wanting to check out Node, but I never actually got round to it. And that's because I was actually quite an adamant fan of PHP. But for the requirements of this project, and because I wanted to explore a little bit more, I really wanted real-time data, obviously, because that's a core requirement for this project. So speaking of libraries, for real-time data communication, I decided on using something called Feathers.js. Now, Feathers.js is a bit of a wrapper for sockets in JavaScript, and it's really, really nice because it works on both the front and back end, and it allows you to, it's a more simplified version of sockets. And again, it's something I've heard a lot about over the past couple of years. I've seen quite a few people make some really cool stuff with Feathers, and I wanted to check it out myself too. So we've heard quite a bit about the back end. Now let's have a little look at the front end. Now, the front end wasn't really going to be that big of a challenge for me, and that is because I am relatively experienced with React. Although up until this point I hadn't actually done much in React for a good couple of years, I am very well familiar with how it works and the overall design philosophy around React, and that's the reason why I chose it, because I wanted something that would be that wouldn't get in my way. Basically, I wanted something that would just allow me to get to my goal as quickly as possible and not get in my way, and allow me to make the most elegant code as possible without learning stuff on the hoof. So now that I've outlined all the requirements and what this project is, let's just have a little look at what it looks like and how it works. So here it is. This is OneWord. So when a player joins, when a player actually visits the OneWord domain, they'll be redirected to a user creation view, and this is where they have to enter their username. So if I enter my username here, James, and I press start, the user session now has a name attached to it on the server, so the server knows that anyone with a socket ID of this has the name James. So whenever they join a game, the server knows who it is and how to tell the players in that game who it is. So on the front page we have 2 buttons, start game and join random game. So join random game is basically just a matchmaking screen. So this allows users to join public stories that are available for people who have decided to create a story that's public that they don't want to just keep to their friends. So here on Start a Game, as you can see, we can put our prompt title in. So, I don't know, testing story. And we can make it link only, but we won't do that. I'll show you how the matchmaking works. So create the story. Here we go. So this is the main view of the game. When we type a word, for example, testing, press enter. And as you can see, the word is sent to the server and stored in the database and displayed out on our view here. And that has all been done through real-time data communication, as I'll demonstrate with this. So on our second player, which is to the right of our screen right here, if I type in our name, let's call ourselves player 2, we'll go to join random game because this is actually a public game. So if we press join random game, as you can see, it will find the game and join us to it. And as you can see, we have the word that we've just typed in there already retrieved, ready for the new user to get some context for the story if they're joining later on in the story. So because we've joined, I have to put another word in. And as you can see, typing indicators work, again, all through the power of real-time data communication with feathers. And as you can see, the new player is assigned a different color, so people know who is who. And it works really, really well. And when a player leaves, there's a notification for the other player to let them know that they've left the story. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm actually really happy with how this has turned out, which brings me to what went well. I've definitely been happy with my stack of choice here. It's worked out very, very well. In just 6 weeks, I was able to get this project to where it is now. And while there are a few things that I need to work on, they're very small and they're not game breaking. I'm actually really, really proud of how quickly I was able to do this because I only did it in small little increments. Like I was working probably about an hour and a half to maximum of 2 hours a day on this project. So not a lot of time was put into this. And yet in 6 weeks, I started from scratch and ended up with a fully functioning project. So that's pretty exciting stuff. So building on that, I think using React was a really good choice. And that's just mostly because I'm really experienced with it. And because I'm experienced with it, it didn't get in my way. I felt very comfortable with it. And as a result, I was able to write code that was elegant enough for me to work in a way that didn't slow me down, you know? And that's the problem with taking on new technologies into your stack. You can end up learning on the fly, and in doing so, you can make a lot of bad quality code, which is fine, because you can correct that later on. But I didn't want to do any more learning than I absolutely had to for this, because I just wanted to brush up on my front-end skills and focus on learning on the fly with the back-end, because I was already relatively experienced with front-end stuff, so I wanted to really hone my skills on the back end rather than waste my time on the front end where I'm already relatively competent. So that brings me again to the back end and the use of Node and feathers. Although it was quite difficult because I've never actually programmed a back end in Node before. I've never worked with Express, I've never worked with anything to do with real-time data communication. So it was actually uncharted territory for me, and sockets were very, very confusing, especially through feathers. I found the documentation a little bit unclear in places. That being said, after a little while and a bit of perseverance, I got used to it. And I found it a lot of fun to work with once I got with the mindset and the design philosophy of feathers, as difficult and as complex as it can sometimes be. And I think that's only because I'm not that used to the CRUD design pattern. So feathers actually follows the create, update, delete design pattern, and that wasn't something that I was actually keeping in mind when I started developing this project, and therefore I was sort of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. I was making a lot of mistakes with my architecture when it came to things like roots and how sockets worked, and how rooms worked and different things like that. I found it quite cumbersome. But then when I adapted to the CRUD way of thinking, it kind of helped me out a little bit and I was able to adapt. Even though it was still limiting in places, I was able to get around it. And it was a big learning curve, but as a result, having done a few projects since then with Node, I do feel a lot more competent now in making backend projects with JavaScript and Node. Another thing I'm actually really proud of is the code quality. Now, I'm not actually that happy with how I've named the different variables and functions, because there are some names that actually use synonyms of each other. So for instance, for any new games that have been started, I sometimes call them games, I sometimes call them sessions. That isn't good, because it can be quite confusing figuring out what's what and what I'm referring to. in any particular place in the code, so I definitely need to sort that out. As you can see, this is our main app.js file, so this is what gets run by the server. And as you can see, this is actually a very clean file. It's only 62 lines long, and this basically just registers the different routes for Express, so you can actually use Feathers.js to get things like messages, sessions, and users. So those are all the different routes for Feathers to use. So if we take a little look at our services folder, which contains all of our different services, such as the user service, which is in charge of, well, yeah, users. So people who join stories, their names, their player IDs, that sort of stuff. So if we look in here, it has its own class. It also takes care of data validation for users in init validators function. So as you can see here, before a user is created, we validate the user object. And as you can see here, we also have errors being thrown, and that returns then a JSON error, which is then interpreted by the front end, and it gives you a nice little alert, which the user can then adjust their data accordingly to get through without an error. So let's just take a little look at game session service, because this is probably our most complex service of all. Weighing in at 207 lines of code. It's quite hefty, and there's a few reasons for this, because we have to keep track of session IDs. We also need to make sure that players' stories are visible to the public if that's been enabled, and we need to keep track of that. And this also has like a matchmaking feature in it as well, and it's quite a complex service for what this is. It checks for things like how many players are in a lobby. And if there are too many players in the lobby, it will kick you. So if you're trying to join a story that is full, so it has 4 players in it, it will just immediately kick you out, and it will stop you from joining the story. If you're not a part of the story, then it won't allow you to submit data to that story. So if you figured out a way to somehow send a bit of data through a socket to a story that you're not a part of, it will throw an error telling you that you can't do that. So here's a quick little summary of what I've learnt with this project. So the first thing is definitely by far real-time data communication. And this is something I've always been really hyped to work with. And I'm really glad that I finally had an opportunity to give this a little play around with. Like, I'm really, really excited to have actually made a project with completely valid, real, not like polling or anything like that, proper sockets, real-time data communication between the server and the client. I am so thrilled to have done a project with that works relatively well. And I think the third most important thing I've learned with this project is probably how important file structure is. That has taught me a lot about how to write elegant backends. I'm not necessarily saying it's an elegant backend. There are a lot of things that need to improve, but it's definitely taught me the benefits of having your code decompartmentalized into lots of small pieces, into little files where you know where things are. Because what you see a lot oftentimes with different Node or JavaScript projects is that all of the code is put into one gigantic file. And the problem with this structure is that if there's a problem, I mean, it's the same with my P5.js project, for instance, right? If you're trying to find a bit of code that's in something, so let's say I'm looking for the code for, when the color changes on a button highlight in the buttons on P5 UI, I have to scroll up, find where the, the button class is. Whereas if the button class had its own file, so button.js and the components folder, well, I would know if I was in the app.js file in the root of the project directory, I could just go into components, button.js, there it is. I can get the code that I need straight away without hesitating. With what I've done with the OneWord backend, everything's nice and decompartmentalized, functions are kept to a minimal size, and I feel like it's quite clear by the language that I use in the names for functions and variables what things do. So it's self-evident, it sort of documents itself in a way. And I think finally, the last most important thing I learned from this project was how much you can get done by just doing little bits every day. So as I mentioned earlier, with this project, I was able to complete it within about 6 weeks. The really cool thing about that was I didn't really spend that much time every day programming. I did program this project more or less every day, didn't take that many breaks. The occasional day every week or something like that, maybe every 2 weeks, just depending on how I felt. I never spent more than about 2 hours a day, and I think my average was probably about an hour and a half a day. And I think it taught me a lot. I mean, it kind of harps back to the Pomodoro technique with studying, doing lots of studying in little chunks, you know, and that's basically what, you know, the philosophy that I followed in programming this project. I wanted to sort of apply the same sort of idea to it, and I think it worked really well. It stopped me from getting burnt out, it kept my ideas fresh. It also made it easier to not get stuck on problems, because if you're not working for like 4 or 5 hours on the project in a day, you can sort of like, if you bump into a massive problem, you know, you can end the day feeling really frustrated, thinking, oh, for God's sake, you know, what the hell is this problem? And then the next day, after a bit of sleep, you can wake up the next day, take a look at the project with fresh eyes, and you can see that actually, oh yeah, it's kind of obvious now, this is what the problem is. Now, obviously, this isn't possible for, you know, an industrial setting, or like, you know, in the professional world, you know, obviously you can't just do an hour and a half or 2 hours of coding a day, but it does show you what you can do when you break things down into small little chunks, and how powerful that can be in the right environment. So finally, this brings me to what I could have done better. There are a lot of things that really bug me about it, and one of those things is that the UI is very lackluster. I like the overall aesthetic to it. I think it works really well. I think it sort of plays well to the overall theme of the game. But at the same time, I mean, the UX in OneWord is actually very lacking. I mean, there isn't any really. So there's no tactility to the buttons, for instance. There's no transitions. If I was to join a game through the matchmaking system, there isn't any sort of finesse. You know, if there aren't that many players and the server isn't very burdened, if it's going to respond very quickly, you won't even see that it's loading. It will just instantly join a game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it can kind of leave the user a little bit confused as to what's going on, because they're not getting enough time to sort of catch up with the flow of things. Those are a few things I need to improve. I need to actually improve things like loading screens, so adding a little bit of a delay just to make it so that the user can see what's going on, because if a loading screen just flashes, the user can feel a little bit behind and wondering what's going on. You're like, well, what was that, you know? I want to sort of make it clear that that's what it was. So I need to sort of add a bit of a transition for the loading screen. As well as that, coming back onto more UX things, I also want to add tactility to buttons, so things like ripple effects. So I think this will be implemented through the use of the Material UI library for React, which I think will actually be a better use of our time when it comes to design for this app, because there'll be a lot of benefits when it comes to things like responsive design. Things like animations and transitions are already built into Material UI, so that I think that will be a very good step forward for this project. And then there are just a few other things to do with the game that I'm not overall happy with, things like not being able to see who's in your game. I'd like to make like a little list that a user can click on so that they know which player is which and what color they are. That would be really, really useful. As well as other things like, you know, alerts for when the server goes down. So if you're in the middle of a story and the server, you know, conks out or your connection dies, I'd like to sort of have a little alert for the player so that they know what's going on, because that's a really important part of UX. Like, I don't want them to sort of be left hanging if the server goes down and they don't know what's going on when no one has responded to their last word in the last 5 minutes, you know. I want it to be really clear to the user what's going on and when. So yeah, that is OneWord. It's a project I've been really happy to be working with, and while it's not 100% finished, it's more or less feature complete. There's a few bug fixes I need to sort out, but other than that, I'm pretty happy with this. You know, there's a few things like, you know, variable and function names that need changing here and there, but overall, I'm actually really happy with how this project has turned out, and I'm really, really looking forward to putting it onto a server and releasing it to the public. So, that is my project OneWord. Thank you for watching, and if you liked, give this video a like. If you would like to see more of this content and check out my progress over P5 UI, please subscribe, and we'll have some more content coming out in the near future. Thanks for watching.